Folks, this is Tom Opre, your host to the podcast where we ask the tough questions regarding man's impact on the world's wildlife. Raw and unfiltered, we strive to help you fully understand the real issues at hand. Our goal, ensuring the world's wildlife and wildlife habitat exists forever. Stay tuned for another edition of Shepherds of the Wild.
So let's just start off in the early days. I mean, give me some history about how you ended up, early years and what it was like, how you became a game ranger.
Early on, I wanted to be in the army, military, and I decided I wanted a more active life than peacetime soldiering. After Second World War, I reckon there'd be about 20 years before another war. So my second love was to the wildlife, of course, and the life of a game ranger appealed to me as very active. So that's the direction my life took. I was not much of a scholar, and when I left high school, I was too young to be a game ranger. There was a minimum joining age of 25 years in this part of the world, and I was too young. So I had to spend I wanted to go to university then to buy time, but I was too young to go to university. They advised my father not to send me because it was immediately after Second World War. The university campus, the men's residence, was an old army camp, and they were rougher days than today. So I had to spend my last year at school just getting older and then go to university, which I did, and I was still too young. I was then 19, and the British Colonial Office, who I went and was interviewed by them, and they approved of me joining because I had such support from senior men in the Northern Rhodesian, now Zambian, game department. So I was accepted, and I joined the game department age 20. Yeah.
So why did you have this affinity for the outdoors and wildlife?
Oh, I grew up in it. I mean, from a very small boy, I was bunking school, running away, going into the bush, and at high school I kept guns and hunted. I loved to be in the bush and collecting eagles' nests, climbing the highest hills. I always had to have a purpose for doing that, and it was either collecting the eagles' eggs, so that took me up bigger trees, bigger hills, everything, and I also loved sport, but I wasn't much of a scholar. Yeah.
But you lived in a time that was pretty unique in this part of the world. Describe to me what it was like to grow up in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, as you got your career started.
Well, I do describe that in the memoir, how it truly was a unique situation here, because we were we didn't know it, but we were in the dying days of the biggest empire ever. We were in the dying days of colonialism. This country, when I was born, was only, I think, 13 years old when I was born. So we were a very young country. In this country, our white population at the peak was about 240, 250,000, men, women, and children. We had 14 languages spoken, some dominant tribes, and we were an independent colony. In fact, this country was the first country to declare war on Germany, along with Britain, apparently, ahead of Canada, Australia, anywhere else. So there was a deep loyalty. The white population here was very, very English-oriented, and so it was quite unique. And so I grew up in that stuff. The emotion was high. When I was a child, the number of white Zimbabweans, or as we are now, Rhodesians, who managed the country, as I said, was very, very small. Male portion of that population even smaller. And then the enlistment when the Second World War broke out, and in which I was a child, the actual commitment of manpower by this country was greater even than Britain's. So that's a very emotional environment to grow up in. Yeah.
What was race relations like back then?
I would say we were racist, obviously, but paternalistic. The relationship, but it was such that in this country when I grew up, there was virtually no theft. You could leave your shopping list at a shop in town and say you'd come back later, and they'd just put your stuff you wanted in a brown paper bag, and if you didn't come, they just put it on the street with a name on it. You could go have dinner, go to a movie, come back 10 o'clock at night or whatever, and your brown paper bag would be on the street in front of the shop. Nobody would take it. So it was very different that way in this environment we grew up. But it was paternalistic, which was today seen as bad. But I think if you think of the time, it was very understandable because I said earlier, the country was only 13 years old, roughly, and I was born in a modern city, Bulawayo, but it was only 40 years before that, roughly, that our pioneers had crushed the power of King Lungulu here. And so people in America, for example, don't realize that if you look at something like the slave trade, that it had been stopped on the west coast of Africa, really by the British and Americans, and thousands of lives had been lost, not only in the slave trade, but in stopping it. The American Civil War, which part of that, etc. Now, when our pioneers came here, we have the record. And so Cecil Rhodes' company, who financed them, came into the country. And when they did have the two Matabele Wars, as we call them, the record is there. They captured many cattle when they broke the power of the king, and all the cattle that belonged to the people were just returned to them, but the cattle that belonged to the king were retained to help pay for the cost of the war, essentially, and that was 50,000 in Bulawayo, which was the king's capital. But what they also record, and they don't give the numbers, but they record that they released thousands of slaves. That was just 40 years before I was born, roughly. And it was only shortly before that, in the northern part of the country I have operated in mostly, Zambia, as it now is, that Sir Harry Johnson, using Indian troops, had crushed the power of the slave trading chiefs. So in those days that I'm talking of, that are shortly before I was born here, the three main, and they were trades, the three main trades of Africa had been, as far as I know, for thousands of years, the trade of ivory, the trade of gold, and the trade of people. People were capturing and selling their own people. And that only stopped just before I was born here. When that was stopped on the west coast of Africa, it all shifted to the east coast of Africa. And you can read Livingstone's travels and all these things and read about it. So it was a unique time in history. And I was part of that very small population. And then, not long after, when I joined the game department, etc., my life started to become very complicated because I obviously conscripted into the army. I had military interests. So more and more I was operating in the army. I was also operating in the game department. And I began to make some breakthroughs in thinking, trying to understand the habitat destruction of wildlife and humans that I was observing in very, very wild country, particularly in Zambia initially, but it was occurring before we even formed national parks. We were removing the people to create national parks, but I was observing the whole purpose of the national park is biodiversity, but the biodiversity was already decreasing. So I noticed that as a 21-year-old and began to set my sights on that. But it became very complicated because of the events I mentioned, all happening at the same time. And so I've tried to describe that in the book. It'd be a bit long to repeat it all here.
Yeah, well, what you're dealing with politics, right?
Sorry?
The politics of the times.
Well, yes, eventually I had to do that. But now when I was observing the decline in biodiversity in very wild areas, I had a unique opportunity. Frank Fraser Darling, who was probably one of the top ecologists in the world at that time, later he was knighted, and I called him FD, Fraser Darling. He spent 6 weeks with me, sent out by the Colonial Office, and in 6 weeks in the bush here, side by side at the campfire every night, sleeping side by side. You spend 6 weeks with one of the top ecologists in the world, and you're a fanatical young scientist like I was, and you're seeing this biodiversity loss. Naturally, we discussed it. We discussed it many times. And in fact, at one point, one evening in the Murruwantipa, he actually said to me, "Allan, why don't you shut up? You're a bore." And I said, "FD, I have no intention of shutting up. This is my country. These are my people. This is the wildlife I love. And I can't just watch it declining, and I'm the person in charge," because by then I was a provincial game officer. People are expecting answers from me, and I don't know what to do. What should I do? And he had no idea. Now, when you, as a young scientist, have 6 weeks cheek by jowl with a person of that caliber, and you find he has no answers, naturally that set my mind to saying, I've got to solve this. So it was a big change point for me.
So you became, at a very young age, I think you had to be 25 to be a game officer, but you were able to get
I was 21.
Yeah, you were able to start earlier because of not only your experience in the military, but also your education. So tell me, what education did you get? Do you have a degree in some sort of ecology? I know you talked about wildlife and botany and all that stuff in your book, but what education did you have, and what did you come out of college with, and how did you get this job?
Well, I've mentioned how I got the job, but what I came out of college with was just 3 years of an undergraduate degree, Bachelor of Science, and my majors were botany and zoology, which I picked because I intended to go into the game department. And in those, it was the early days of ecology. We had ecology taught in both departments. And at that point, nothing had ever struck with me. I wasn't a bright student. I got through chemistry by learning it like a parrot. That's how I dealt with things. But when it came to biology, it was different. When it came to ecology, I just felt like a young Mozart. I felt like a duckling thrown into water. I didn't even have to study it. I just listened to the professors. I just read the papers. I never had to reread them. It was just wonderful. But I began to, we were a very small university, and we knew our professors. They became friends. And I began to argue with them as a student and say to our professor of botany, where we're learning plant ecology, I would say, but what about the animals? Because I couldn't perceive how you could ever have soils, plants, animals together and learn about plant ecology. That doesn't make sense to me. And he would say to me, Savory, if you want to be a zoologist, go to the damn zoology department. And I'd say, we're a small university. You know I'm majoring there. I get the same answer there when I'd go to our zoology professor, and I would raise the same thing. Why are we learning animal ecology without plants? It doesn't make sense to me. And he would say, Savory, he was a more blunt man, he would say, Savory, if you want to be a bloody botanist, go to the bloody botan department. And I'd say, please, Professor, just answer my question. I would never get answers. So my rebellion against my academic training began at university. But we were small university, friends with our professors. They never took it personally. And in fact, I graduated and left. I never went back to my graduation. I just wanted to be in the bush. I did hear later, so I can't validate it, but I know they wrote to my father asking him to send me back to university to pursue academic studies, but I wouldn't do that. And I do know that the comment was made, apparently I'd got the highest marks ever, along with the one professor's son who was with me. He also got very high marks.
Yeah. So why did you have this conflict? Why were you, at a point where you just asked all these questions and you weren't getting answers? But why? At that point, you're young. I mean, what did you experience? Was it just reading the books and it didn't make sense to you, or was it based on some sort of, knowledge you had from being in the field?
No, it was just, let's use common sense. You, right now, does it make sense to you to have plant ecology? Where are the animals? It just didn't make sense to me as a young student. And to have animal ecology without plants, it just didn't make sense. And later, I was to see textbooks published in America about fire ecology. How can you possibly have fire ecology? Fire is a tool. It oxidizes vegetation. It doesn't have an ecology. But that's coming out of top universities in America. It doesn't even make sense to a child. I said, why don't we then write textbooks about chainsaw ecology? Why don't we write textbooks about chemical ecology? The chemicals we're using on the land. But that is coming out of our top educational institutions today.
So 21 years old, you get your first opportunity to get in the bush. Explain to me, what is it you did, and what were some of the trials and tribulations in those first handful of years when you were working for the game department?
Well, the trials and tribulations was I initially found it so bureaucratic, and I wasn't able to use my skills. I was just like a Gunga Din in Kipling's poems. And so I decided that's how Englishmen were, because that was the colonial office. That wasn't us Rhodesians. And I thought our own people wouldn't be like that. So I notified my director that I would seek a transfer from that game department to one that was developing here. And he said he wouldn't stand in my way. And at that time, I was called into the army and had to come down for an intensive 3 months of training. And while I was planning to come out of it and seek employment here, I got a message from the Northern Rhodesian Game Department from the director appealing to me to come back and saying that they wanted to promote me to be provincial game officer of the Northern Province. Now, the Northern Province that you know today is very small. At that time, that was, I think it's 4 provinces now. It was a very big area. It was right from the Congo, the Luapula River, Banguela Swamps, to the Luangwa, down almost to Serengeti. It was an area I think as great or greater than Britain. And so I couldn't resist that. Here I was, 21-year-old, and I'm going to be in charge of that. Now I will be able to do scientific work and not just be a Gunga Din. And so I cancelled my plans to transfer and went back into a senior position. Yeah.
So in those years when you were up there as a game officer, you were starting to get to do some research. What were the key things that you were able to discover, or things that became readily apparent based on the time you spent in the bush in those years?
I discovered almost nothing. One thing I did begin to do was to connect the burning. The policy in game department, and it still is, it hasn't changed in 70 years. The basic policy was you stop poaching, you fight poachers because they're causing the problem, you kill animals that are causing conflict with humans. So we killed managing lions and hippo that were killing people, and elephants and so on, and you burn the land. And you burn the land in the dry season, generally as early as you can, to get a green flush of grass for the animals. So those were our three things. Now, I very quickly began to put two and two together and say that the poachers aren't the problem animals aren't the problem, the degradation of the environment is the problem, and the main agent I could see was that we were burning the land every year. And so I had no resources for research because I was in this administrative role, and so I did what I could. And I wrote my first paper pointing out what I was observing, that the erosion, the degradation, the loss of biodiversity, at the base of this was the amount of burning we were doing of the land. Now, I put that to a prominent journal at the time, and they wouldn't publish, because that went contrary to everybody's view for thousands of years. So that was my first example of rejection. If you just discover something new today, and later, we discovered that there's a lot of truth in that. And then again, with primitive, no research budget, etc., I began to see if I could associate the number of elephants I was having to kill with the burning. And so in the Munyamadzi corridor between the two Luangwa game reserves, there's the big grass plains. And I could go there, get on any high point, and see the backs, not the young elephants, but I could see the backs of at least 600 elephants around me. So there were an awful lot of elephants. Now, we always burnt that as soon as we could. And then I would have to be killing elephants, raiding crops. So what I did was to start to study the elephant's diet. Now, I didn't have the budget for microscopes, or laboratories, any of this. I had my rifle, I had a blanket, I had a small haversack with food. I was in the bush, but I had a cooking pot that a carrier was carrying. So I could take the stomach contents of the elephants and put it in water in a pot and sort it out. And with a little 10-power magnifying glass, I could begin to look at that. And the belief at the time amongst all of us, elephant hunters, biologists, everybody, the belief was that elephants eat mostly trees, bushes, and shrubs. What I found in the stomach samples, because I didn't want to observe elephants because they feed mostly at night. So I wanted to take the stomach samples, and what I found was over 60% roughly of the diet wasn't trees, shrubs, and bark. It was grass. Now that alerted me to something. And then I thought, well, if they're concentrating on these grasslands, and then we in the game department burn the grasslands, what do? They turn to another food, and what is easiest? The grain in the people's fields and the grain bins. And then we shoot them as problem elephants. So in the next year after I discovered that, I spoke to the senior chief down there, Nabale, and I said to him, look, we're giving you the maximum protection from problem animals, and we're shooting roughly 200 a year here. And I said, what I propose next year is I give you all the protection I can until you burn the grass. I said, we're not going to burn the grass, and if you don't burn, I'll give you all the protection I can. But if you burn the grass, I withdraw, and you get no more protection. So we agreed on that, Chief and I, and the next year we had to shoot 1 or 2 elephants.
So it was a direct correlation to the burning.
There was a direct correlation to the burning, yes.
But also at the same time, people have been burning these landscapes for a long, long time, longer than colonial times. Was there similar, I mean, what was the situation before colonial times? If you're burning, would it cause the same issue to have that predation of crops by the local people, by elephants?
Well, Tom, go deeper. Go deeper. People acquired the use of fire, we don't know exactly when, but maybe 100,000 years ago, the use of fire, and then we don't know exactly when we learned to light a fire. All right, so let's say 50,000 years ago or whatever it was. The problem began there because no animal, through millions, billions of years, no animal had ever had the ability to light fire. So suddenly you had us, who are not a predator, an omnivorous scavenger. Look at your teeth. Look at a pig's teeth. An omnivorous scavenger that could light fire, had language, could organize. It began then.
But is there documentation of what you discovered was by the very practices of the game department? You guys were, basically creating this situation where you had this wildlife conflict with people.
Yes, we
But did it exist prior to the colonial management?
No, because there weren't game reserves or national parks, so it wasn't. Okay, but what I'm saying about it was our management I was detecting that was causing the problem. Not the elephants, not the people, it was our management. And today, as we speak, if I took you to any one of 30 national parks around where we're sitting right now, you'd see the same thing. Burn, fight poaching, blame poachers. It's the same thing today. It hasn't changed in 70 years.
All right, so let's continue on with your career. You're up there in northern Rhodesia, the northern province, but you leave. Some things transpired. What happened and where did you end up?
Well, when I left, I wanted to go to Tanganyika, now Tanzania, and Jerry Swinnerton was the game warden there. I had met Jerry in the Rukwa Valley, and so on. So I was going to go up there because they had a post for elephant control officer at Nachingwea, and they were planning to shoot about 2,000 elephants a year. Elephants were the animals I loved most, and I wanted to study them. So that would give me an exceptional opportunity. So I applied for that, and Jerry assured me I got the job, but I waited for the confirmation and never came. But I'd already resigned, so I came back to this country and transferred to the Tsetse department until there was a post in the game department. And just after I'd done so, a woman who'd been my secretary in Kasame in the northern province, with her husband, happened to drive up from northern Rhodesia to Kenya, and at Mbeya they stopped in for tea. And in those days there used to be a green board in most hotels with crossed tape where people stuck letters for anybody in the district because the post was so bad. And as they stopped for tea, they saw a letter addressed to me. And so she took it and posted it on to me because the letter had been sent to me in Mbeya, not in Mparakoso. So that's how I didn't get that job. So I had to write to Jerry quickly and apologize and say, I just didn't get it. A clerk in Dar es Salaam sent the letter to the wrong place. So that's why I ended up here.
So after that, you took the job in southern Rhodesia, and you're working in tsetse fly control areas. Tell me about what is a tsetse fly? What was it doing in the landscape then? And what were you trying to, how was that working for or against what your train of thought was on management?
Well, the tsetse fly, there's some, in the genus, a couple of species, basically carries 2 diseases. One was known as Ngana, which affected horses, cattle, dogs, virtually all domestic animals, but not the wild game. And the other was what we call sleeping sickness that affected humans, and you very seldom recovered. And if you recovered and you were bitten again, you died, was the knowledge at the time. So where in America the pioneers could work with horses, ox wagons, etc., here in this area, right where you're sitting, our pioneers couldn't. If you brought a dog up here, or a horse up here, or an ox up here, it died pretty fast. So most exploration, everything was done on foot. Yeah, so these fly belts, as they called them, big areas of Africa where the tsetse fly were, had fairly defined boundaries. These fly belts had receded during the rinderpest. So the rinderpest was a disease that swept down Africa from Ethiopia, and it killed off thousands of cattle, etc. Now, people said, well, the fly receded because their blood supply receded. Well, most of the cattle dying weren't in the fly areas. But it also, rinderpest, killed off thousands of buffalo and other game. So they said, well, there's the answer. It cut down their blood supply. So with that thinking, the thinking of the biologists in this country and the experts was, if we want to stop these fly from re-expanding to areas like this where you're sitting now, what we have to do is to reduce the blood supply. So we have to kill all the animals so there's no blood supply. So when I grew up and when I came back and joined the tsetse department, that was our policy that I inherited. And in this country, if you look at the record, the tsetse department with government hunters killed over 700,000 head of game. Now, that jarred with me as a lover of wildlife, but at least now I was in the department doing research. And I quickly began to do that and find that there wasn't a connection with the blood and fire supply, and there was a connection with the burning, etc. Now, John Ford was the director. He was antagonistic to that policy he'd inherited. So with very rudimentary stuff, I was able to give him information, support him, and he got the policy stopped. So that we stopped while I was in the department. Yeah.
How did burning impact tsetse flies, and explain how that worked?
Well, this is not proven. This is what I was going to work as a research officer now with their department, as I was for a brief period. I thought, well, now I need to investigate this. Let me look at the life cycle of the fly. And I found that when I looked at the research and the life cycle of the fly, I found it's quite unique. The female only lays about 6 eggs in her life. That's very unusual. And she buries them in certain sites that are suitable for the larvae to hatch. And these sites that they bury them in are sandy, bare soil, etc. And so I thought, well, let's see if we can connect these. Because if you look at the effects of burning, now, to destroy the game and to make the hunting easier for the government hunters, the tsetse department was burning everything. Because then you've got more visibility of the game to shoot the 700,000. I said, well, let's look at the effect of that burning. If you burn any time of the year, what is the main thing that burning does? The main thing it does anywhere in the world is expose soil. And if you expose soil, what happens? You get rain falling on it and erosion. And if you get erosion, you get gullies. And in gullies, you get deposits of sand, etc. In other words, I developed the theory that I wanted to work on, that I think we're spreading the fly by our management, because we're increasing the breeding success of a very slow breeding insect. That made more sense to me as an ecologist than we are cutting or stopping them by cutting their blood supply, because I found they were taking the blood of anything. Because when we killed the flies and took the blood and sampled it, It was of bush pigs, it was of warthogs, it was of lions, it was of all sorts of animals. It wasn't just buffalo and the animals that died in rinderpest. So there was abundant evidence here that we needed to study this. Well, I never did complete it because at the end of the year, I was able to transfer it to the game department. So that never got completed. It'd be worth studying someday.
Yeah, no, that would be interesting. So let's go on. Game department now. This is early 1960s.
This is 1960.
Give me what happened over the next 10 years.
Well, next few years. When I joined the game department here, I didn't get the game post. There were 3 professional posts, but I got the quelea control post. So my job when I joined the game department, I was just glad to be back in the game department. My job was to kill queleas. Now, most people don't know, but they're a little finch. They're the feathered locusts of Africa. If you have wheat crops or things, sorghum crops, they'll descend by the millions and devour the whole damn crop. So the government was, of course, killing them, and that was my job. Now, I knew nothing about quelea, so I had to begin at the beginning, and I thought, well, I'll go to South Africa, because Dirk Lourens, who had been at university with me, was in charge of quelea control in South Africa, and in this region of Africa, there are different quelea in other parts of Africa, but the species here, quelea lathami, we were dealing with, surrounding countries were. So Dirk was a researcher, he'd done his PhD on that, he was in charge of it, so I sent myself down to South Africa to study with them and see what I could do, see what they were doing. And I found they were spraying the colonies, the breeding colonies or the roosting colonies, with parathion. That's a very toxic poison. According to their research, if just a drop hit the feathers of a bird, it would die. It was that poisonous. Now, when I looked at that and participated with them on aerial spraying at night of the roosts and this parathion coming down and the guys on the ground with protective clothing, and then the people, thousands or millions of birds dead in the morning, and the people would come and collect them to eat. I thought, what the hell's happening to the people, the storks, all the birds that are coming to eat these dead birds? Because there's going to be an effect along the pyramid. And so that horrified me. And I said, what else have you ever done? And they said, well, what we have done is where the birds concentrate, we lay petrol drums and blow the whole thing up and just burn them, incinerate them. And I said, well, why don't you do that? Because you can eat the birds and people can eat the birds, etc. He said, well, that's too dangerous. We've stopped that. And I said, well, I want to look at that because I'm not going to approve of parathion in Rhodesia. I'm not going to do that. And so he kindly arranged for me to spend time with the South African Army engineers and learn from them how to blast the fuel, how much fuel to mix, diesel, petrol, how to, when you blast a drum, how to prevent fuel just spreading but not exploding into flame, how to ensure that you spread the flame, not just fuel, as wide as you could, not too high. So I learned all that stuff and how to do it, and I came back to this country, and that's what I did. So for the next year, I identified or located where the big quelea colonies were. It was easy, just watch the flights in the evening with a compass, going in that direction, go 30, 40 miles that way. The next evening, watch the flights where the two lines coincide. Third evening, I'd find them, just from the noise of a million birds coming to roost or whatever it was. So once I'd isolated those, I began blowing them up and did that. And that's how we killed quelea. And all the women and children, everybody could come the next day. Storks could come, anything. They could eat the birds. Nobody was poisoned. Nothing was poisoned. We just had an area of 2-3 acres or whatever that was nuked, but would soon recover. So I did that. I tried to get members of the department to join me and build a team to do that, but everybody I invited to join me had some reason to be somewhere else. It was clearly too dangerous and they weren't going to do it. So when I left the department, they went back to poisons.
So continue on. Where did we go from there?
Well, when I left that job, it was because the man who had the game job, Graham Child, who'd been at school with me, a friend of mine, we used to play cricket, etc. together. Graham had got that job, and he wanted to pursue an academic career, really, rather than what we were doing. And so after a year, Graham left to go and pursue an academic career. So that post became available. And so Fraser, who was our director, asked me if I would take that over. So I took over 2 posts for the time being, and started to get back into wildlife research. So now for the rest of my time in the game department, I was in charge of wildlife research for the whole country. So now I was glad to be back there.
So what were the things while you were doing that research? What were the main high points, and why were they high points?
Well, let me cover 2 high points for you. One was when I'd been in northern Rhodesia and watching the slaughter of the Lechwe antelope in the Banguela swamps, which was terrible, with the trade to the copper belt by commercial poachers, which is very different from subsistence poachers. I decided on an idea that I called game ranching. And nobody had ever heard that term. And so I explained it as what my idea was. We would give the wildlife a value to the people greater than they are getting. And in that way, we can hunt the population, because poaching decreases a population. Hunting increases a population if it's done properly. And there's a very big difference there. So I said, let us bring these populations under hunting and game ranching, all right? And the people will all have a living. We'll have millions more of these animals, and all will be well. Now, that idea was so new at the time that I knew if I suggested it as a 21-year-old to older men, it's not going to go anywhere. I mentioned to you, Frank Fraser-Darling was with me, so I asked FD, I said, please, FD, will you propose this? Because if it comes from you, they'll accept it. If it comes from me, they won't. And he said to me, Allan, I won't steal your idea. He was an ethical man, and so I had to pursue it on my own. And I did the best I could to get game ranching going in the Banguela swamps, etc. Now, when I came down here, I still had the same idea. Instead of all this tsetse killing and stuff that's going on, let's intelligently, scientifically, let's hunt the animals and harvest a wild population like people have done for thousands of years without decimating them, and like we do with fisheries in the ocean. In those days, I don't recall fish farms or shrimp farms. We harvested them in the wild. So the idea was to do the same on the land here. And I found that 2 American Fulbright scholars, brilliant ecologists, Dr. Archie Mosman and Dr. Ray Dasman, had come into the country while I was in the Tsetse department, and they'd been brought in as Fulbright scholars by the museum. And I learned from them that they had the same idea. So while I was in the Tsetse department, I learned that. So I thought, the first opportunity, I'll work with them. So we ended up working together. And this is where game ranching began. And so, you know.
If you say game ranching, you immediately think, okay, well, ranching, livestock ranching. So we're talking about game. What is it? Why is it?
What I meant by game ranching, I actually said a moment ago. It was that we would harvest the wildlife population in situ, not put fences, not farm them, not the game farming and the conservancies of today, every one of which I've looked at is deteriorating. Okay, not to do that, but to harvest them in the wild like fish in the ocean. We fished and had fishing industries and so on around the shores of every continent for centuries. We didn't fence the ocean. We didn't feed the fish. I didn't want any of that. We weren't going to farm the game, so we were going to harvest them in situ. That's what the idea was.
And it creates protein and a benefit for the local community.
For the benefit of everyone. Everyone. It's not just the local community. You're a human. Everybody listening to us is a human. You can survive longer without water and longer without food than you can with habitat. I was looking at habitat destruction, not only for wildlife, but for humans.
Good. So what's the next step here? So there's major events starting to happen in this country, in Rhodesia, South and North.
Well, you asked me for the two of the key points, and that was one, was getting game ranching going, and I described that in the memoir. And the other was, while Graham had been in charge of research in this country, he hadn't seen that as important, and he hadn't seen the degradation of habitat as important. But when he left and I took over, those were, to me, the critical issues. So not only did I start working with the game ranching, but I began to look at our future national parks, like the Zambezi, Mana Pools, etc. What was happening in Wankie that was one national park we already had. And what I wanted to look at there was similar to what I'd looked at in northern Rhodesia, in the areas we were setting aside as national parks. And I was finding terrible loss of biodiversity and destruction. Whole species, reedbuck were disappearing, bushbuck were disappearing, etc. So I began to research that. And that led, as I described in a TED talk that went to 9 million people, that led to me committing one of the biggest blunders of my life. Because my research proved that deterioration was too many animals, too many elephants, too many buffalo, etc. Now, that's been a human belief, and it still is today. I've heard it in your own language, that if land is being damaged and animals are there are too many animals. So all I was doing as a scientist and a human was confirming what we believed. Scientists, being human, don't believe what they see. It's the other way around, and I was a typical scientist. So the land was being damaged, the reed beds were disappearing, the animals were disappearing, many of the species, others were increasing, and I studied that, and easily I proved what every scientist in the world believes. This damages too many animals. So I wrote reports on that, and I was ordered to rewrite them, because I recommended we would have to cull the animals, not hunt, cull the animals and bring the level down to the numbers, carrying capacity that the land could hold. Still a belief of almost every scientist in the world. And I believed that, so I wrote a report saying we needed to do this. I was ordered to rewrite the report. So I rewrote the report, but I didn't change my recommendation. I was ordered again to rewrite the report. So I rewrote the report, but I didn't change my recommendation. And then I was notified that I was dismissed. I was to be fired out of hand. No right of appeal from the game department.
All because you wanted to see culling.
Yeah, so I fought that. And fortunately, we had a very fair man in charge of the Civil Service Commission. We went through, I think it was 4 days of court of inquiry. The director was forced to give the grounds on which I was being fired, and there were 42 allegations against me. 42. There wasn't a single allegation against my work. All of them were against my character, my personality, my motive. When I faced with the court with 42 allegations, I immediately said 2 allegations are correct. I accept them. The rest are not. And the 2 allegations that were correct was I was critical of the leadership. I was critical of people that were ordering me as an ecologist to change my reports. And the second one, a bit embarrassing, I was accused of bad behavior with the director's wife. That was a bit amusing. I said, I'm guilty. I told her to behave herself when she came into my darkroom and made approaches. That was very embarrassing. Now, the other things all went through court of inquiry. The director brought in all the game rangers and people who gave evidence, and everything just broke down. And then we had a tea break when the judges went out, and only he and I were in the room. I was looking out the window, and he came up to me and asked me if I'd be prepared to withdraw. I said, hang on, I'm not firing you, you're firing me. I can't withdraw, only you can, because I'm not trying to fire you. So he said to me, if I agreed to not pursue it further, and he withdrew, would I agree to that? I said, of course I will. I'm just trying to bring us together. And so when the court came back and reconvened, he said he wanted to make a statement, and he confessed to the court that the entire report and dismissal of me was based on a spirit of spite, etc. And the judges, he said he wanted to withdraw all allegations, and so the judges turned to me and said, do I now want to pursue this further against him? And I said, no. I said, he talked to me at tea break, and I've shaken hands and agreed I will not pursue that. So I was reinstated in the game department.
Okay. So continue on with your career, though. Where do we go from here?
Well, let's continue with the culling. All right, so when I was reinstated, shortly after that I was superseded, etc. It was obvious, the writing was on the wall. I'm not a fit with bureaucracy, I don't fit. So I decided if I was to pursue my scientific work, I could not do honest science in an institution. I came to that conclusion, that what to me is honest science was extremely difficult to do in any institutional organization. So I decided I need to be an independent scientist. I didn't know how to do that, but I resigned and I became independent scientist. I didn't know how I was going to finance myself or anything, because I'd never up to that point worried about my pay or money. I just wanted to do the work. And so after I left, the game department did what I recommended, and the government went ahead, and in the next few years they shot over 40,000 elephants. Now when that happened, of course I was still in the country as an independent scientist. I kept observing, and what I observed was that the damage that was meant to stop increased. It didn't decrease. Now every other scientist, and there were many involved in that, to this day has never confessed to error. I confessed publicly and said we made a mistake. I'm responsible. I wrote the original report. That's the biggest blunder of my life. And interesting, I've been condemned as a bad scientist. So you have to laugh at yourself sometimes. So anyway, that's what I talked about in the TED Talk. I said, 40,000 elephants were shot, and you can Google it, and I'm the man that shot them, etc. People missed the point that from that was great learning. If we brought the population down to the correct carrying capacity, it got worse. Something else was wrong.
And that was?
Management. Back to management, which I'd started with in the 1960s.
So back to burning.
Sorry?
Back to burning.
Management.
Yeah.
Everything. How you manage the economy, how you manage the population, how you manage the environment. And so I just kept trying to study that and find out, why is it when most people are good? We've got an immense amount of knowledge in our universities, our environmental organizations, our governments. We've got incredible knowledge, but we keep getting these unintended consequences. So I said, I've got to focus on that and try to understand that, because nobody, to my knowledge, has ever understood that for thousands of years. And I saw it, in my simple mind, as the biggest problem we were facing as humans, because it's our habitat that's deteriorating.
Thanks for listening. You can find this podcast wherever great podcasts live, including on the Shepherds of Wildlife Society website at shepherdsofwildlife.org. Please tell a friend, and let's save wildlife together.